Now, looking at touchdowns, rushing touchdowns, Jonathan Taylor, again, he led the NFL last week with 7. After the game, he still had the lead, and he has now 10. He had 3 more touchdowns. He's had 3 games with 3 touchdowns so far. All right, welcome to Just the Stats NFL, Top 10's for Thursday. This is my last podcast on the road. I'm Ernie Jennings, your host, and I will be wrapping up podcasts. I've been on vacation, be heading back home. So this will be the last one where I'm outside my office for at least quite a while, I'm assuming. So we're going to take a look tonight. It is tonight, or today, I should say, at some of the season stats so far for 2025. We'll take a look at some of the top players, see who's been moving along compared to last week, who's moved into the top 10, who's moved out, that kind of thing. So, without further ado, let's start. So, we're going to start with the quarterbacks, and we'll look at the passing yards. Well, this has had quite a change. Last week, Justin Herbert had dropped all the way down to 8th. And with his 420 yards, he jumps from 8th all the way to number 1. So this season, he now leads the NFL in passing yards with 1,913 yards passing. Dak Prescott, who was second last week, is second this week with 1,881. And then Matthew Stafford, who only had 182 yards last week, drops down to third with 1,866. So those are your top 3. Patrick Mahomes is a fair amount back with 1,800 exactly in 4th. So those are your top players. Patrick Mahomes moved up a spot. Drake May dropped a few spots in this listing. Players like Jared Goff dropped completely out of the top. No, he's not. He moved to number 9. Who did drop out was Josh Allen, dropped out of the top 10. So there's been some movement for sure. Daniel Jones moved from 7th up to 5th. So he had a lot of moving around, but Justin Herbert was the big mover, all the way up to 1,913 yards so far this season. Now looking at touchdowns this season. Now this is where Matthew Stafford has been incredible. Like I said, he didn't have many yards, but he sure did have a lot of touchdowns. Put it that way. He's now has 17 to lead the NFL. He had 5 touchdowns last week against the Jaguars when they played in London. So he went from tied for 3rd up to 1st. Leapfrogged right over Jared Goff and Dak Prescott, who were Dak Prescott was 2, Jared Goff was 3. And now they stay the same, except that they now have 16 for Prescott. Goff has 15. But Matthew Stafford leapfrogged everybody. That's 17 touchdown passes already. Pretty incredible. And there's still in the top 10, there's still players with 11. Actually, yeah, a few players with 11 who make it just barely into the top 10. We've almost weeded them all out because last week the 5th position player had 11 touchdowns. Now that person's dropped all the way into 10th. And that's Josh Allen, by the way. He had 11 touchdowns last week going into that game last week, and he had no touchdown passes. So he's stuck on 11. So again, Matthew Stafford was 17, Dak Prescott 16, and Jared Goff 15. Pretty good. Now looking at a negative stat, and that's interceptions. When we look at interceptions, well, Tua Tagovailoa, by throwing 3 interceptions 2 games in a row, jumped into the top 10 and now is tied for 1st with Geno Smith. Geno Smith was able to not have, well, he wasn't even playing. Well, I guess he was, but he had 10 interceptions. He still has 10 interceptions. And then there's a drop down. Jake Browning is still 3rd, even though he hasn't played in a couple weeks. He's still 3rd with 8. Joe Flacco, who who took over for Jake Browning, has 6. A couple players, him and Justin Herbert, who had 2, even despite the fact that he had 420 yards passing, also threw 2 interceptions. But they're tied for 4th. And then you have several players with 5 who, pretty much like Trevor Lawrence, for example, still has 5, had 5 last week. Now, his problem is that he's almost so scared to throw an interception that he hangs on to the ball, which is why, when we look at sacks, he's now number 6 in sacks. He's had 2 weeks of being sacked 7 times. He wasn't anywhere near the top 10, and now he's jumped right into it. With 20 times he's been sacked. Now, that's nothing compared to Cam Ward, who has 30, leads the NFL with 30 sacks in 7 games. The next highest is Justin Fields and Drake May with 22. So quite a gap that Cam Ward has on everybody else when it comes to being sacked. Again, not a category you want to be leading the NFL in. He's not having a good season. Some people are blaming him. I don't know. He's just got average players all the way around him, and it's a little difficult, especially when you're talking about wide receivers and people who can get open for him. And he's still learning that. But last week he led the NFL with 25, and he now jumped up with 5 more to move up to 30. A couple other people jumped up here, but not too many. I mean, Drake May moved up with 4. He was sacked 4 times. But it's just been kind of Cam Ward leading this pack and everybody else just trailing behind a fair amount. All right, let's look at, I did interceptions. Yeah, I already did interceptions. So we'll move on to the rushing yards here. Look at some rushing. Look at these running backs in the rushing yards this season. Kind of going through this just to give everybody an idea how things are going. Now, Jonathan Taylor was on a pace, the only player actually, averaging 100 yards a game rushing. He had 603 going into the game. He came out with 697. So he's almost now just slightly dropped under 100 yards a game. He's the only player there. I mean, the next player is 105 yards behind him, and that's Javonte Williams, who has 592 yards. Not bad. Like I said, 100 yards, 105 yards behind Jonathan Taylor. James Cook, who was in second going into this game, dropped all the way to 4th. He had no yards. I guess he must not have played. Oh, they had a bye week, so that explains that. So he's dropped down to 4th. I should have remembered that. Despite the fact that Rico Dowdle did not start the game and split some carries, he's now 3rd in rushing with 551 yards. And then Jahmyr Gibbs is 6th after James Cook, who I mentioned, with 526 yards. There's 8 players with over 500 yards right now. Last week there was only 2. So there's quite a leapfrog of players moving up this list. And it's obviously going to get much better. Right now, then, Jonathan Taylor is really the only player on a pace of 100 yards so far anyway. Now, looking at touchdowns, rushing touchdowns, Jonathan Taylor, again, he led the NFL last week with 7. After the game, he still had the lead, and he has now 10. He had 3 more touchdowns. He's had 3 games with 3 touchdowns so far. That's incredible. You do that, and you're going to start setting some records. So 10 touchdowns right now in 7 games. He's on a very good pace. I mean, you double that 14 games, that's 20. And throw in a couple more. He's in the league to definitely be in the top 10 all time in rushing touchdowns at this pace. Now, Josh Jacobs isn't doing bad either. He's got 8. He had 6 last week, and now he got 2 more. He's up to 8, so he's actually doing pretty well too. Right now, Jonathan Taylor in rushing yards and touchdowns is dominating the running department. After that, you had a couple players with 6. There's a drop, 10 for Taylor, 8 for Jacobs, and then 6 and 5 after that. So we'll see what happens. The players last year that were so good in touchdowns, James Cook has 5, not bad. He had 16 last year, so he's not on a pace for that amount of touchdowns. Close, but not quite the same pace. Derrick Henry had 16. He's only got 4 so far. So he's also not on a pace that he had last year, which, you can't expect that every year anyway. But he's the kind of player, Derrick Henry, that is, that should be able to get to 10. If they could just have games where he's on the field more often, they should have a good chance at it. All right, let's look at one more rushing category before I jump ship here on the running department, and that is rushing quarterbacks. Let's take a look at that. Well, Justin Fields leads this category with 257 yards. He leapfrogged only by 3 yards Josh Allen, who did have a bye week, who's at 254. And then Patrick Mahomes jumped up to 250. So those three players have a fair lead over Jaden Daniels has 211, and Drake May, who had a really good game. Drake May wasn't even in the top 10, is now number 5 with 200 yards rushing this season so far. So no one's on any incredible pace. Justin Fields has not been putting up the same amount of numbers. He only had 22 yards because he was splitting time with Tyrod Taylor, despite the fact that Justin Fields has the most rushing yards in a single game with, I believe it is 80 or 82 yards this season, something like that. Has not been putting up many yards because he's just not playing well. He's really having a bad year, and I think they're trying to figure out between him and Taylor who could actually play quarterback for the Jets. It appears maybe neither one of them really can. I don't know what they're going to do. They might, whether they pick up somebody that's available or if they just say we're going to try to win the draft by having the worst record in the NFL. Obviously, they won't say that out loud, but that's a possibility. All right, so those are your top quarterbacks as far as yards go. Now, rushing TDs, this is definitely going to be Jalen Hurts with 5. You do have Patrick Mahomes and Daniel Jones with 4. I mentioned this earlier. I didn't think Taylor would have as many touchdowns as he has because of Daniel Jones stealing touchdowns from him, but their offense has been so prolific that they got enough touchdowns to spread around, I guess is what I'm saying. So you have just Jalen Hurts right now, who's him and Josh Allen, who has 3 touchdowns, are on a pace, especially this year, just Josh Allen, to break the all-time NFL record for most rushing touchdowns by a quarterback. Cam Newton holds that record right now. But I think whatever Josh Allen gets, Jalen Hurts is gaining on him fast and has started a year or two later than Josh Allen. So whatever record Allen sets, I think Jalen Hurts is on a pace to pass him at some point. But we'll see how that goes. All right, so those are your leaders in rushing yards and touchdowns as far as quarterbacks. All right, let's take a look at the receivers. And let me get that chart up here and we'll look at that. The season leaders in receptions. And this has been quite a move up this chart by Jamar Chase. He had 10 and then he had 16. 16 last week gave him the opportunity to move it number 1 in receptions with 58. And that's primarily because Puka Nacua did not play. Jamar Chase went from 5th to 1st. Puka Nacua is still 2nd with 54, but like I said, he didn't play, so that's the opportunity Jamar Chase was looking for. Now, Jamar Chase led the NFL last year in receptions, yards, and receiving touchdowns. So now he's back in the lead as far as receptions go. We'll look at yards here in a minute. But I'm not sure when Puka Nacua will be back. Now, 3rd on this list with 53 receptions is running back Christian McCaffrey. So number 3 in the NFL in receiving receptions is a running back. And then 4th is still Jake Ferguson, tight end with 51. Got a couple wide receivers, running back, and a tight end in the top 4. Jackson Smith-Njigba has 50 receptions right now. And I mention that just to say that now he leads the NFL by quite a bit with 819 yards on 50 receptions, averaging 16.4 yards a reception. Really having a good year. Now, Puka Nacua was hanging with him, but missing a game is really detrimental to keeping up with him. Jamar Chase is now second in receiving yards, but he's 190 yards behind Jackson Smith-Njigba. So he's going to have to put up quite a few big games if he has any chance of catching Jackson this year. I don't think we'll see a Triple Crown winner like Jamar Chase did last year. So when we look at this, he had over 100 yards again, Smith-Njigba did. George Pickens had a decent game. He was in third, he dropped to fourth, and that's because of Jamar Chase jumping up over, leapfrogging him. The rookie, Emeka Egbuka, didn't have a big game, had about 62 yards. I didn't even know if he was going to play. They kept talking about he was injured, but he did play some. And he's really going to have to be able to step it up because Tampa Bay, Godwin, we don't know if he'll play and how well he'll play when he comes back. Mike Evans is now out for most of the regular season, possibly be back for playoffs with a broken collarbone that needs to be mended. So Emeka Egbuka really needs to be able to get on the field and stay there and put up some good numbers. All right, so those are your top 7 are all wide receivers. And then at number 8 is Christian McCaffrey, the running back, with 516 receiving yards, which is more than he has rushing. He's having quite a season as a receiver. Like I said, 53 receptions, 516 yards. Not bad as far as running backs go, averaging almost 10 yards a reception at 9.7. Not bad. And if you look at somebody like Kamara for the Saints, his yards per reception is so minuscule. It's hardly worth the pass. The way they've been working their running back out of the backfield for receptions, it's just not been effective at all. So looking at a couple of other players, like I said, Jamar Chase went from 5th to 2nd. Not a lot of big movers here. Really, Drake London dropped out of the top 10, as did Zay Flowers. They both dropped out of the top 10 and were replaced by Cortland Sutton, who was able to move into the top 10, as well as Devontae Smith with that big game he had of 183 yards. That leapfrogged him way up the list to make it into the top 10 now. So newcomer there when it comes to yards. Now, looking at touchdowns, receiving touchdowns. Well, it's Amon-Ra St. Brown with 7. He's the only player with 7. He had 6. He got 1 last year. He was tied with Pickens, who had 6 and did not get a touchdown reception last week. So it's now 7 for Amon-Ra St. Brown. And Davante Adams jumped into the top 10 when he had 3 touchdown receptions last week in London. In the game where Stafford threw 5 touchdowns, 3 of them went to Davante Adams. He is now tied for 2nd with 6. He's tied with George Pickens and the tight end Jake Ferguson, all with 6. And then you have the rest of the players in the top 10 all have 5. So last week there were 10 players with 4. So now you have 6 players with 5. So there's been a move, increase in these touchdown receptions this week to raise that bar up. If you want to be in the top 10, like next week, you might be able to get into with 5, but you're probably going to have to get to at least 6 within a week or two. And it'll obviously keep going up. Now, last year, Jamar Chase, I believe, had 17 touchdown receptions. Amon-Ra St. Brown has 7. So in 14 games, he'd have 14. As a slim possibility, he could get to 17 himself, which isn't enough to be in the top 10 all time, but to reach a number that Jamar Chase had last year. That's what he'd have to do. Now Jamar Chase has 5, so he's working on the idea of another Triple Crown. We'll see if he can keep moving up the charts here. Like I said, he wasn't on the charts, and now he's in the top 10. And he did the same thing where he's leading the NFL in receptions as well. So there's a possibility that he will be able to do it. All right. Now, let's look at receptions by running backs. I've already talked about Christian McCaffrey. That was what was confusing me because I see his name and I thought, well, we already talked about him. But Christian McCaffrey is dominating. I mean, literally dominating this category of receptions and yards by running backs. Last week he had 46. This week he has 53 receptions this season. Next best is Bijan Robinson. Well, let me get that up here. Like I said, next up is Devon Achane with 32 receptions. So 21 fewer receptions by the second place guy. Bijan Robinson has 30. There's a drop down to Jahmyr Gibbs with 26. And then the top 10, Kenneth Gainwell rounds it out with 21. But Christian McCaffrey, 53 receptions already. He's in the top 10 in the NFL, not just among running backs, but in all receivers. So he's having an incredible year as a receiver, which for the 49ers has been great because they're having difficulties keeping wide receivers on the field. So he's been basically a good complement to that and been helping out their offense by running the ball and catching the ball. He also dominates in yards by quite a bit. He's got 516 yards this season receiving. Next best is Bijan Robinson with 390. So, like I said, you're talking about a mile difference. They've been the top 2. They stayed that way, and Chain was number 3. He's still number 3 with 211. So you got 516 for McCaffrey, dropped down to 390 for Robinson, which is a good number. And then you drop from him another 170 yards almost, 180 yards almost, to Devon Achane with only 211. What a drop off that is. And then Bucky Irving, who hasn't played, is still third with 109 or fourth with 193. So one player over 500, one player over 300, one player over 200. It's been interesting. I should put that a little differently. One player over 200, or 3 players over 200, 2 over 300, and 1 over 500, if you want to look at it like that. There's just a big difference between McCaffrey and everybody else. I mean, Robinson's trying to keep pace. Now, Robinson has played one less game, so he could really, as far as yards go, could tighten this up. As far as receptions, he's 23 receptions behind McCaffrey, so that's going to be a hard category for him to catch, for any running back to catch McCaffrey in that category. Like I said, we'll look at this at some point in this, maybe in a couple weeks or whatever, at the all-time record. But McCaffrey is poising himself to set records as far as most receptions, most receiving yards, and most touchdowns receiving by a running back. All right, the last category we're going to take a peek at, and that's just receiving touchdowns by a running back, if I can get it up here, is 3. That's it. Now that's Christian McCaffrey, Kyren Williams, and Devon Achane all have 3 receiving touchdowns to lead the NFL. I believe McCaffrey needs about 3 more to tie for the all-time NFL record of 36, I believe it is, touchdown receptions. We'll take a look at that in the future. And then rounding out the top 9, you have quite a few players with 2, and then there's a multitude with 1. So that's a look at some of the stats of quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. I just wanted to get a quick look, as we try to watch who's standing out. Right now, there's just a few players that are standing out. McCaffrey, and there's a big worry about him because of injury, but so far, 7 games in, He's looked really good. Doesn't seem to have the injury bug as many other players on his own team are. So he's definitely a candidate. And as far as quarterbacks go right now, that's kind of up in the air. You got, Stafford, I think, has looked quite good. So he's one that I would pick. And as far as receivers right now, Smith and Najigba. Those three players are leading their different departments by fairly large margins in some ways. Now, the quarterback's a little bit tighter, and we'll have to see how that is. But at any point, Stafford could put up an easy 300 for him, and he'll have to do that in some games. Last week against the Jaguars, he only had 182, but he didn't need to throw that much. They won 35-7, so there was no need to put up 300 yards. They just were trying to run the clock out, basically. All right, so that's a look. Appreciate you listening. Please like and subscribe to this podcast. You can find it on YouTube at Just the Stats NFL. Also, you can find it on your podcast sites like Spotify, Apple, whatever podcast app you might use. If you don't find it on your app and you saw it somewhere else, let me know and I'll make sure it gets onto that app. Also, you can contact me if you'd like it. Just the Stats NFL. That's just the Stats NFL at gmail.com. Sometimes I say it fast and the program I use will think I say justice, but it's just the. All right. Again, thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe. And that is a wrap for this episode of Top 10's for Thursday.